All right, so today we're jumping to one of the most fascinating and honestly weirdest periods of the entire 20th century, Détente. This was a time when the world's two biggest superpowers, eyeball to eyeball on the brink of nuclear war, suddenly decided to take a breath, to try and build a more stable, predictable relationship. But here's the thing, this thaw in the Cold War, it didn't last. Which brings us to our big question for today. In the 1970s, it really looked like the Cold War was winding down. So, what on earth happened? First things first, what does détente even mean? Well, it's a French word for relaxation. But, and this is super important, the goal wasn't to end the Cold War. Nope, the disagreements were still way too deep for that. The idea was to manage the conflict. Set up some rules of the road and seriously reduce that terrifying risk of nuclear annihilation. It was all about turning a chaotic, super dangerous rivalry into a predictable, manageable system. Okay, so let's get into how they tried to do this. We're going to start with the first major achievement of this whole new era, a totally groundbreaking treaty to try and limit the most dangerous weapons on planet Earth. And here it is, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I for short. This was a huge deal. I mean, for the very first time ever, the US and the USSR actually agreed to put limits on their nuclear arsenals. They capped their anti-ballistic missile systems, put a freeze on the number of new long-range missile launchers, and even laid out some basic principles for how to not blow up the world. Now, on one hand, the treaty was this powerful symbol. It showed that cooperation was possible, but it had some massive, and I mean massive, loopholes. For instance, it didn't limit the number of strategic bombers. And, even more critical, it didn't restrict something called MIRVs. That's a fancy acronym for multiple warheads that you could stick onto a single missile. And that little omission, well, it turned out to be a really, really big problem.
The historian Stephen Ambrose just absolutely nailed it with this quote. He said that freezing the missiles but not their multiple warheads was like freezing the cavalry but not the tanks. Think about that. The arms race wasn't over at all. It was just getting smarter and a whole lot deadlier.
So you've got this new spirit of cooperation, right? But how's it going to hold up when things get real? The first major stress test came just a year later, in the Middle East, with the 1973 Yom-Kippur War. It was a textbook Cold War proxy fight. When the Soviet-backed forces were about to lose, Brezhnev threatened to send in his own troops. Nixon's response? He put all U.S. forces, including the nuclear bombers, on high alert. For a terrifying moment, it looked like détente was dead. But then, they both pulled back from the brink. They agreed to a UN peacekeeping force instead. So, the crisis showed that détente was incredibly fragile, but it also showed that, hey, these new lines of communication, they were actually working.
And you know what's wild? Despite that really close call, the momentum for cooperation actually kept going. It all led up to what a lot of people consider the absolute high point of détente, right in 1975. Just picture this for a second. Years after this bitter, intense race to the moon, you've got an American Apollo spacecraft and a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft docking together high above the Earth. The hatches swing open and the rival crews meet in the middle and shake hands. What an incredible, powerful symbol for this new era. And listen, this wasn't just for show. The official Soviet view, which you can see here, straight from Brezhnev himself, was that this mission was a practical contribution to world peace. It showed the entire planet that maybe, just maybe, cooperation was possible. That very same year, something even bigger happened, the Helsinki Accords. 35 nations signed on to this massive agreement, which was broken into 3 baskets. Basket 1, everybody accepted Europe's borders as they were after World War II. Basket 2, pledges for cooperation in science and economics. And then there was Basket 3, the most controversial one. Everyone promised to respect basic human rights. So, on the surface, right, things had never been better. The Helsinki Accords seemed to lock in peace in Europe. But even as everyone was celebrating these incredible achievements, the very foundations of détente were already cracking. The historian John Lewis Gaddis came up with the perfect metaphor for this. He wrote that détente was like this beautiful building that was built on quicksand. The outside looked great, but underneath, all these deep, unresolved issues were about to swallow the whole thing. So why quicksand? Well, it's because both sides signed the exact same agreement for completely different, even opposite reasons. The Soviets really wanted recognition of their control over Eastern Europe and a boost to their economy. They got all that in baskets 1 and 2.
The US, they wanted a tool to pressure the Soviets on human rights, which they got in Basket 3. See the problem? And if you want proof of how the Soviets really felt about that human rights promise, just listen to this. Privately, they saw it as just a piece of paper they never intended to honor. Their ambassador pretty much said, hey, we're the masters of our own house and we'll do whatever we want. So much for that promise.
Meanwhile, what was going on with that arms race they were supposed to be limiting? Well, this chart tells the whole story. Just look. In the years after SALT I was signed, the number of actual missiles kind of stayed flat. But thanks to that big MERV loophole we talked about, the number of nuclear warheads, it skyrocketed. On both sides, the arms race wasn't ending, it was actually speeding up.
So, all of these cracks in the foundation, the mistrust, the different motives, the accelerating arms race, it all led to a rapid, and I mean dramatic, collapse of the entire Détente framework in the late 1970s. By the late 70s, any trust that was left had just evaporated. In the US, there was this growing feeling that the Soviets were just cheating, breaking the spirit of Détente by supporting communist movements in places like Angola. Then the Iran hostage crisis happened, which made America feel humiliated and weak, and it fueled this public demand for a much tougher foreign policy. And the final collapse happened with staggering speed. This timeline of just the year 1979 shows it all. In June, you've got Carter and Brezhnev signing a brand new arms treaty, SALT II. By November, the Iran hostage crisis explodes. And then in December came the final killing blow. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government. For the United States, this was the ultimate betrayal. It was just a blatant act of aggression that killed any last shred of hope for cooperation. President Carter immediately pulled the SALT II treaty from the Senate. And just like that, the era of détente was officially over. So yeah, détente failed. It didn't end the Cold War, which would roar back to life and last for another decade. But it wasn't a total failure either. For a few years, it created some stability, it opened up dialogue, and it proved that even the most bitter enemies could find common ground to avoid blowing each other up. Which kind of leaves us with one last question to think about. What can we learn from its brief but really complicated success?